When I came back from deployment, my house was gone. Not damaged, not broken into, just gone. And in its place was a brand new family living like I never existed. My name is Marcus Cole. I'm 34 years old. And I grew up in a small town in Georgia called Millbrook. The kind of place where everybody knows your name. Where the Baptist church fills up on Sunday, and the diner on Main Street has had the same menu since 1987. And I grew up with red dirt on my boots, and the smell of pine trees in the morning air. Because that place wasn't just a location on a map to me. It was everything. My grandfather, James Earl Cole, built our family home in 1962, pouring every single dollar he ever saved into that land, 3 acres. Not a lot by some people's standards, but to us it was a kingdom, where he planted a pecan tree the year my grandmother was born, built the porch with lumber he cut himself, raised my father, and my father raised me. And when my grandfather passed, the land went to my father. And when my father passed from a heart attack during my second deployment, that land passed to me, making me not just its owner, but its guardian. The last Cole standing. And that land was the only piece of my family that couldn't die. I joined the Army at 19 not because I had no other options, but because I genuinely believed in something bigger than myself. Doing 3 tours total, Iraq twice, Afghanistan once, seeing things I won't describe here, and losing friends I still talk to in my dreams. But every single time, the weight got too heavy, and the world felt unrecognizable. I thought about those 3 acres, that pecan tree, and coming home. When I left for my 3rd deployment, I made arrangements like I always did. Paid my property taxes 6 months in advance, hired a property manager named Dennis, an old family friend I trusted completely, set up automatic payments, and had a lawyer named Gerald Hutchins handle any legal documents. Because I had done this twice before without a single problem, and had no reason to believe the 3rd time would be any different. I was wrong about that too. Millbrook changed while I was gone, because when I was a kid our neighborhood was just a neighborhood where people had yards, waved at each other, and nobody governed your grass height or told you what color to paint your shutters. But sometime in the mid-2010s a developer named Richard Caldwell moved in and changed everything. A man who looked like a politician but operated like a machine. Tall and silver-haired, always in pressed shirts, driving a black Mercedes with the handshake of a man who always wanted something from you. And he built a new subdivision on the east side of Millbrook called Crestwood Estates, and brought with it something none of us old-timers had ever wanted or asked for: the Crestwood Homeowners Association. My grandfather's land technically sat on the southern edge of what became Crestwood Estates, and when the development was built, the HOA claimed our property fell under their jurisdiction, even though our land had existed 40 years before any of those beige houses were ever constructed. It was never properly resolved. My father had argued about it. I had argued about it. But we had always managed to keep them at bay because we were present, and they knew we would push back. But the moment I got on that plane for Afghanistan, Richard Caldwell apparently decided that my absence was his opportunity. He was the HOA president, with 4 board members who did whatever he said, and a relationship with a local attorney named Philip Shore, the kind of lawyer who found loopholes not to protect the innocent but to exploit them. And together these men formed a small, quiet machine of corruption in a town just small enough that nobody with real power was watching. They started with fines for grass too long, fines for a fence that had stood since 1978, fine after fine after fine, each one documented, each one sent by certified mail to an address they knew I wasn't at, each one going unanswered because how could I answer mail from a foxhole in Kandahar? And once they had accumulated enough fake debt on paper, Caldwell and Shore walked into a county courtroom and filed for a lien on my property, which a semi-retired judge named Horace Briggs, who had known Richard Caldwell for 30 years and golfed with him on Saturdays, approved without question, and then quietly, without a single phone call to a soldier overseas, they auctioned off my grandfather's land, and Richard Caldwell bought it himself for $11,000, 3 acres in a growing Georgia county. The land my grandfather built, the pecan tree my grandmother was born under, for $11,000. I came home in November, stepping off the plane in Atlanta and feeling that thick, warm Georgia air that smelled like pine and earth hit my face. Thinking I made it. I actually made it back this time. And my buddy Terrence picked me up from the airport and we didn't talk much on the drive back to Millbrook because we never did. We'd served together for 8 years and communicated mostly in silence and the occasional joke nobody else would understand. But when we turned onto the road that led to my grandfather's property, Terrence got quiet in a different way, just driving slowly without saying a word. And I looked out the window and my heart stopped, because there was a construction crew on my land. Not near my land, but on my land. already clearing the back section. And the pecan tree, that old, ancient pecan tree my grandfather had planted the year my grandmother was born, was gone, cut down. Nothing left but a raw pale stump in the November light like a wound that hadn't had time to close. I got out of the car before Terrence even stopped it fully, walked onto the property, and a construction worker told me I was trespassing. A worker on land my grandfather built told me I was trespassing, and I didn't yell or push anyone because I was trained to hold it together under fire, and I held it together then, asking who owned the land, getting the name Richard Caldwell, asking when it was sold and getting nothing, until the worker pointed me toward a shiny professional sign near the road. That read future site of Crestwood Estates Phase 2, coming spring, and I stood there a long time staring at that sign, thinking about my grandfather, thinking about the last crackling phone call I had with my father before he died, when he said, "Marcus, whatever you do, don't let them take the land. That land is the family." Words he spoke as a general principle of life without knowing they would become prophecy. But they had come, and they had taken it, and my father's dying wish was burning inside my chest, like something I could not put out. I called my lawyer Gerald Hutchins, and he didn't pick up, called again and got voicemail. Drove to his office only to be told by a secretary that he had retired 6 months ago, with no forwarding contact and no files transferred to anyone, just gone. And I sat in my car outside the empty office, and for the first time since coming home, I let myself feel the full weight of what had happened. I had survived 3 wars. I had come home, and the only thing I had left of my family, the only piece of ground that connected me to every person who had ever loved me, had been stolen by men in polo shirts while I was defending their freedom. And I gave myself exactly 15 minutes to feel that, and then I started planning. I couldn't afford a big firm, but I reached out to a veterans legal aid organization in Atlanta, and they connected me with an attorney named Diana Park, 38 years old, Korean American, 5 feet 3 inches tall, and the most precise, relentless legal mind I had ever encountered. And she didn't take the case because she felt sorry for me, but because, as she told me in our first meeting, she smelled fraud and had never walked away from fraud in her life. And when we started digging, what we found was bigger than either of us expected. The fines that had generated the lien were mostly fabricated. Diana pulled the original code enforcement logs and compared them to the HOA's claimed inspection records, and the dates didn't match, with several inspections logged on days when the HOA's own meeting minutes show the inspector was at a board meeting across town, and one inspection logged on a Sunday, when the county office was closed. A paperwork trail so sloppy and arrogant it was clearly the work of people who never imagined anyone would look closely. But that's where it got truly dark, because Diana found a wire transfer of $3,000 sent from a shell company connected to Richard Caldwell's Real Estate LLC directly to Dennis's personal account 2 weeks before the first fabricated fine was issued, meaning Dennis hadn't just failed to protect the property but had been paid to look the other way, paid to disappear, paid to make sure I had no one on the ground who would notice what was happening, until it was too late. And Gerald Hutchins, my lawyer, hadn't retired voluntarily either. Diana tracked it and found he had quietly been offered a consulting contract by Philip Shore's firm, the same Philip Shore who filed the fraudulent lien, meaning Gerald hadn't just retired but had abandoned me and been paid for it. And then there was Judge Horace Briggs, whose son, it turned out, had recently been hired as a project manager for Crestwood Estates Phase 2, the very development being built on my grandfather's land, the same son who had been unemployed for 2 years before suddenly landing a 6-figure construction management position 2 months before his father approved the lien against my property. This wasn't HOA overreach or a paperwork error. This was a coordinated, multi-person conspiracy to steal the land of a deployed soldier using fabricated debt, compromised legal representation, and a corrupted judicial process. And when Diana looked at me across the conference table, after we had laid it all out, she said very calmly, "Marcus, they didn't just take your land. They took it the way people take things when they're absolutely certain they'll never be caught. Which means they've done this before. And when we started looking, we found to other families, both minorities, both with properties on the edges of Crestwood Estates, both having lost land in similar quiet paperwork buried ways over the past 6 years, including an elderly black woman named Mrs. Gertrude Simmons who had lost a half-acre that had been in her family since the 1940s, fought it alone without a lawyer, lost, and assumed it was just the system. She hadn't known it was Richard Caldwell, but now she knew. Diana filed a multi-count federal lawsuit covering fraud, civil rights violations under the Service Members Civil Relief Act, conspiracy, and racketeering, naming Richard Caldwell, Philip Shore, Dennis, the entire HOA board, and filing a judicial misconduct complaint against Horace Briggs with the Georgia Judicial Qualifications Commission. And then on the day the suit was filed, Diana made one additional move I didn't expect. She called the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, and the story ran on a Tuesday morning, under the headline, "HOA conspired to steal deployed soldiers' land. Federal lawsuit alleges," picked up by 3 national outlets by noon. Shared by a veterans advocacy group with 2 million social media followers by evening. And by the next morning, there were cameras outside Richard Caldwell's office. I watched a video clip online of a reporter catching Caldwell in his parking lot, and he looked polished and calm at first, the way powerful men always do when they think they can still manage the situation, saying it was all a misunderstanding, that proper procedures had been followed, that he had nothing but respect for veterans. And then the reporter asked him about the wire transfer to Dennis, and the camera caught his face in that exact moment, just for 1 second before he composed himself and said, "I have no comment on that." And his lawyer appeared at his elbow and steered him away. Just 1 second where the mask came off and he looked like a man who had just felt the ground open beneath his feet. And I felt nothing close to satisfaction in that moment. I want to be honest about that, because watching him squirm didn't give me back my grandfather's land or the pecan tree, or those years overseas wondering if I'd ever see it again. But it gave me something I hadn't felt since stepping off that plane in November. The feeling that the truth was finally louder than the lies. The federal court hearing was the moment everything became real. Caldwell's attorneys tried procedural defenses, tried to call the SCRA violations technical and unintentional. But Diana methodically and quietly destroyed every argument, presenting the wire transfers, the falsified inspection logs, the timeline of the judge's son's employment, and the testimony of Mrs. Gertrude Simmons, who walked into that courtroom at 7 years old, sat straight in her chair, and described in a quiet, clear voice the day she found out her family's land was gone. And then came the moment I will carry with me for the rest of my life, when the Honorable Judge Carol Whitman looked directly at Richard Caldwell and said this court finds sufficient cause to believe that the property acquisition at issue was executed through a deliberate and coordinated scheme designed to exploit the legal vulnerability of an active duty service member. This is not a gray area. This is not a procedural dispute. This is fraud. And then Judge Whitman ordered something that made the entire defense table go pale, because she didn't just order my land returned, but ordered a forensic audit of all HOA property transactions in Crestwood Estates, going back 10 years. Every lien, every fine, every forced sale, every single transaction the HOA had ever touched now going under a legal microscope. And pending the outcome of that audit, she placed the entire subdivision, all 340 homes and 47 undeveloped lots, under court-supervised receivership, freezing Richard Caldwell's empire so that he could not sell, develop, transfer, or encumber a single piece of Crestwood Estates until the investigation was complete, because he had tried to take 3 acres from a soldier, and the court took his entire kingdom. The land was officially returned to me for months later, and I drove out there alone on the morning the paperwork finalized. A cool early March day with that Georgia air that only exists in March. Cool, but with just the first edge of warmth underneath it, like a promise. The construction crew gone, the machinery gone, the phase to sign taken down by court order. And it was just the land. My grandfather's land, my land. And I walked the full 3 acres slowly, seeing the fence my grandfather built still partly standing. The foundation of the old porch still there with those hand-cut stones, set into the earth decades ago. And then I came to the ground where the pecan tree had stood, still raw, still marked by that pale stump. And I stood there for a long time, because I'm not a man who cries easily. The army trained a lot of that out of me, and honestly the places I've been trained the rest. But standing there looking at that stump, I let myself grieve. Not just for the tree, but for my grandfather who planted it, for my father who sat under it, for the version of me that used to climb it as a kid, and thought the world was a simple, manageable place. And then I reached into my jacket pocket and took out a small cloth bag I had picked up from a nursery on the highway that morning. Inside it, a young pecan sapling with roots bundled carefully in damp cloth. And I knelt down in the Georgia dirt in the same spot where the old tree had stood and planted it, knowing it'll be 30 years before that tree gives meaningful shade, but understanding, just as my grandfather had, that the most important things we do are the ones whose rewards we'll never personally collect. Richard Caldwell was indicted on federal fraud charges along with Philip Shore, and to HOA board members. Dennis cooperated with prosecutors in exchange for a reduced sentence. Judge Horace Briggs resigned from the bench. Under pressure from the Judicial Qualifications Commission investigation, Mrs. Gertrude Simmons' family filed their own suit, and the forensic audit ultimately identified 9 properties improperly transferred through the HOA scheme over a decade. And while my lawyers are still working on several of those cases, the thing I want you to understand, the thing that matters more than the legal outcome or the headlines or the court orders, is that I was not special, not uniquely brave or clever, just a man who refused to accept that power could simply take something and make it permanent. And I was fortunate, deeply and genuinely fortunate, to have Diana Park in my corner and Veterans Legal Aid and the SCRA protecting me. Because a lot of people face exactly what I faced without those tools. And Mrs. Simmons faced it and didn't have them and lost. And that's the part that stays with me in the quiet mornings, when I sit in the temporary plastic chair near the old porch foundation drinking coffee and watching that little sapling bend in the Georgia wind, knowing that not everyone who fights like I fought gets back what I got back, and that isn't justice, but luck and access and privilege dressed up as justice. Because real justice would mean no HOA board, no corrupted judge, no paid-off property manager, no opportunistic developer could ever do what was done to me or Mrs. Simmons in the first place. And we're not there yet, but we're talking about it now. And sometimes the first step toward changing something is simply refusing to be quiet about it. Because I'm home now, really home for the first time in a long time, with a lifetime of work waiting in those 3 acres and a small slender sapling, just a few feet tall, swaying in the wind like it's not sure of its place in the world yet. But its roots are in Georgia soil, and nobody is taking it this time.